If you like what you're listening to, support this podcast on Patreon. Patreon.com, search Phil Dawson, or find a link in the show notes and join up. It's very much appreciated. Thank you for listening. Before we begin, I wanted to say thank you to our first YouTube commenters. So thank you so much for commenting on the videos and saying that you appreciate the work that we're putting in, or I'm putting in, to get these out for you guys. And I really appreciate that some of you are listening and commenting and letting me know that you are enjoying it. And I'll continue to put out as much as I can, as fast as I can. And we'll be moving on to the next book, I think, in this cycle, as soon as we're done with this one. So we'll just keep it going. So I appreciate the support, appreciate you commenting, saying, hey, what's up? Give me your thoughts. All of that stuff is very much appreciated. So thank you very much for listening and for interacting. With that, let's get to Chapter 18. Chapter 18, Urza's Tower. It was 3 years after the fall of Krug that Tawnos finally rejoined Urza in the most southwesterly of the Argivian provinces. They were hard years, and their toll showed on the apprentice's face. Years of running and hiding, of flight and patience, of work and abandoned work. Kayla was with him, and Harbin, her son, born in the midst of a monsoon outside Joralin, and now 2.5. They were also accompanied by 2 animated statues Tawnos had created during that horrible second winter, when Falaji's slave-taking patrols had forced them to flee into the Kur ridges. They had finally made their way into the Corliss itself, but even then did not believe they were safe. The Corlisians were still trading with the Falaji, and though they were negotiating with the Argivians on a pact of mutual protection from the Desert Raiders, Kayla was unsure the fugitives would not be turned over to Mishra's representatives as a sign of the merchants' goodwill. They traveled in secret, and mostly at night. They did not give their real names, though there were enough who recognized Kayla's profile, particularly in the ocean coastal towns, to provide needed aid. It was that very recognition and the threat of exposure it brought that convinced the former queen to head north and east toward Argiv and Sanctuary. When word finally reached them that, yes, Urza was in Argiv near the Corlisian border, the 3, accompanied by their 2 artificial protectors, made their way to Urza's tower. This was more easily proposed than accomplished. Urza had selected a site far from towns or villages, hard on the flanks of the Kur ridges themselves. The bale of his tower was cloaked in a continual fog, fed by mountain streams cascading to the valley floor around it. To the casual observer, it was a shadowed mountain glen, similar to hundreds of others along the western borders of Corliss and Argiv. But this vale curved and extended slightly to the north, and in that northern pocket, hidden by the mists, Urza built his sanctuary. Out of those mists came 5 murky figures, a man on horseback, a woman, and a boy on a sturdy pony, and 2 silent statues, tirelessly keeping pace. The tower itself was made of white stone and topped by a golden cupola. It looked slender and lonely, flanked by the valley walls themselves. Kayla noted that there was no sign of activity about the place. She commented that it looked as if it had been abandoned. Tawnos agreed. In the old days, in Yosha, there would have been an ornithopter patrol continually in the air over such an important site. Indeed, were it not for the loyal Yoshan expatriate found in the nearby town 2 days previous, they would have missed the tower entirely. The child, Harbin, squealed and twisted in his place in front of his mother. Misty air was a delight for the child, and he kept trying to reach out and grab a handful of it. Tawnos tried explaining that air could not be caught, at least not with one's hands. The boy listened, stern-faced, nodded in agreement, and attempted to grapple with the air the moment Tawnos' back was turned. Tawnos pulled his mount under 100 paces from the tower. The place was silent as a tombstone. Where were the protections? Had Urza truly abandoned this tower, or had they already been spotted? But if the latter, why was there no welcome? There was a movement to Tawnos' right, and he suddenly wheeled the horse in place. Out of the mountain shadows came the reflection of light on metal and a curious, low, chirping sound. A figure stepped into view, followed by a second and a third. They were a cross between men and metallic insects, their long ant-like heads perched on spindly necks. They looked as if they were wearing metallic armor pitted by flecks of rust. Then Tawnos realized this armor was their body. Beneath the plates, the apprentice could see the mechanisms and the levers clatter, forcing the creatures to move forward. Their knees bent backward, like the Avengers, though these constructs were barely as tall as a man's shoulder. They were armed with heavy cleavers mounted on poles, which they brandished at the travelers. The machines were silent. The chirping was nothing more than the wear of metal on metal, of pulleys hissing from cables running through their loops, and of brass trip switches setting and resetting. Tanos heard a strangled cry and looked toward Kayla. There were another 3 on her side of the road, similarly armed and armored. The 2 groups were converging on the travelers. Tanos barked a command at the statues. One of the 5 they understood, and spurred his mount forward, shouting for Kayla to follow. The horse, a weathered old beast, whickered a complaint and moved forward slowly. Equally slowly, the 2 clay statues turned toward their assailants. Each of them had been taught to recognize weapons and to attack those bearing them. The number of targets confused the statues for a moment, then each statue chose a wing of the assailants. What followed was a silent battle, one without shouts or cries. The clay statues were armed only with their fists, but they were huge, ham-handed fists with a great deal of power behind them. The metal automatons were quick, and with their weapons had a reach that the statues lacked. A deadly ballet ensued, punctuated by the ring of hard blows landed on armor and the soft chopping noise of blades digging into earth and flesh. The 2 lead automatons of each wing got too close to the statues and were rewarded with hammer blows to the face. One dodged, but the other caught the blow head-on. Its spindly neck snapped, and the head fell across the creature's back, still held on by a tangle of loose wires. The rest of the body did not recognize the loss, but still flailed at the clay opponent with its chopping blade. The blades dug deep, but the clay closed as soon as the blades cut through it, like soft dough incised by a bread knife. One of the chopping blades got hopelessly mired in the clay's creature, and the statue reached out and grasped the automaton's head. It squeezed, and bits of the automaton became permanently lodged in the statue's huge hands as it shattered the creature's skull. 2 of the automatons fell back, then counterattacked as one. The clay statue raised an arm to ward off the blow, and both attempted to chop at the same arm. The first blade cut deep, and the second deeper still. There was a dull ring of metal on metal, and a snapping noise as the second automaton cut through a metal bone at the heart of the clay statue arm. The statue raised that arm, but most of the clay was sloughing off of it, revealing a thin metal framework beneath. While the automatons and statues battled, Tanos and Kayla rode for the tower. If Urza was there, then these would be his creations, and he could call them off. If he was absent, the tower might provide some sanctuary until the clay statues had defeated their foes. Tanos shouted at the tower and saw movement along the upper battlement. A tall, familiar figure raised a whistle to his lips. There was the short piping of 3 notes, and Tanos turned in his saddle to see the automatons had ceased their attacks. Unfortunately, the clay statues still saw them as threats, and one snapped off another neck before Tanos shouted the word for them to stand down. The clay statues halted as well, one in mid-punch. Tanos looked up, but the figure was gone from the battlements. The front door opened, and a second figure emerged. This was not Urza, but he had the leanness of the chief artificer, and Tanos wondered if he had been mistaken about the figure seen above. This man was dressed in the uniform of a Yoshin officer of flyer. By the looks of the shadows where patches and insignia once hung, he was a lieutenant, or had been, back when the Yoshins had an armed force. The figure dropped to one knee before the mounted figures. "Your Majesty," he said to the Queen. "Good Sir Tanos, the artificer bids you welcome to his tower. If he had known you were coming, he would have deactivated the guards. I am Sharman. Please enter, and make yourself welcome." He went to Kayla's horse to help her dismount, and instead received a handful of young Harbin. The former lieutenant looked as if he had been handed a bag of live snakes, and quickly, but gently, put the sandy-haired child down while Kayla dismounted. The lad ignored his brusque treatment, but instead craned his head up toward the battlements. Tanos looked up and saw the flicker of a familiar figure of the chief artificer as Urza moved back into the shadows of the balcony doorway. Then the slender figure was gone entirely. Tanos dismounted as Sharman said, "If you'll follow me, I am to make you welcome, to escort you to the artificer." Kayla said, "That will be fine." Sharman paused, then said, "Your Majesty, I apologize. I was instructed to make both of you welcome, but to bring good Sir Tanos to Master Urza. I hope this is not a problem." Kayla and Tanos looked at each other. Tanos had been sure Urza would wish to see his wife first, after all these years. Now there was a tightness to the Queen's lips, and she nodded her agreement. Sharman put the Queen and Harbin in an austere waiting room on the lower floor, informing them he would return with drinks and, if the mother permitted, sugar wafers. This endeared him immediately to Harbin, who squealed as Kayla gave her assent. The former lieutenant took Tanos up several sets of stairs. "How is he?" asked Tawnos at one landing. "He is," said Sharman briefly. "He's been through a lot." As we all have, thought Tawnos, but he said nothing as Sharman pushed open the final door and stood aside for Tawnos to enter. The apprentice stepped into Urza's study, and Sharman closed the door softly behind him. The room was tasteful and tidy, verging on severe. A thin rug partially covered the window floor, and several tilted drawing boards stood near the windows, all covered with plans in various stages of development. A ball and socket joint, carved of yarrow wood, lay on a small work table next to an open book. Urza himself was at the balcony, his back to Tawnos, looking out over the foggy vale and the remains of the earlier battle. His hands were clasped behind him. Tawnos waited. At last Urza let out a great sigh and turned toward Tawnos. "I had expected a message first," the older man said. Tawnos saw the lines on Urza's face, a small collection at the corner of each eye. His eyes seemed deeper as well, more sunken in their sockets, and his hair was turning fully to the shade of spun white gold. He wore his work smock, but it was clean and well pressed. Tawnos said, "Messages can be interrupted, sir, and we were not sure of your location until we passed the Argivian border." Urza nodded offhandedly and took another deep breath. Then he forced a smile. "It is good to see that you are alive. I worried when there was no news." "We spent longer than we should have in Yosha," said Tawnos. "Yes," said Urza, pressing his palms together and twisting them slowly. "I suppose you had to. Look on my desk, would you? On the book holder there." Tawnos walked over to the desk. "The Jalum Tome," he said at last. "The Jalum Tome," repeated Urza. "You succeeded, Tawnos. All the knowledge you loaded into that ornithopter, young Rendell made it to Argiv, and everything was waiting for me when I finally got to Pendragon. Most of my work and our papers, there was some loss, but nothing that could be recouped. One student packed a list of laundry to be picked up, thinking it was an important paper, but under the circumstances, it was a brilliant move." Urza looked at Tawnos. "Thank you." "It was my responsibility," said Tawnos, bowing slightly. "And more than adequately discharged," said Urza. "Those statues you brought with you, very impressive." "Clay over a framework of wicker and metal," replied Tawnos. "That is more than just clay," said Urza. "It seemed to shrug off the blows of my own soldiers." "Yes, sir," said Tawnos, wondering why they were speaking of such matters while Kayla was still waiting. "It was from a deposit we found when Her Majesty and I were hiding in the mountains. It had the property of flowing and rejoining when cut. At first I thought it might contain something similar to the Thron stones, but now I'm not sure. If I could locate the primal nature of this earth, we could make wonderful creations." "Yes," said Urza, and suddenly pointed toward a corner of his workshop. "That chest. Look inside." Tawnos looked quizzically at the older artificer, but did as he was asked. When Tawnos opened the coffer, he was nearly blinded by the light of the stones within. "Power stones!" "Aye," said Urza, pride in his voice. "I've never seen this many in one place," remarked the apprentice. "Aye," repeated Urza. "While we were doing the best we could with what we had collected in Krug, the Argivian nobles have been collecting them for over 40 years. There's much more than that, more than enough power, any number of devices. That's what the Yoshan soldiers operate off of." "Yoshan?" said Tawnos, a small stab of pain in his voice. Urza held up his hands. "A small conceit. My guards. They're smaller than the Avengers and easier to produce. I call them Yoshan soldiers because they will, I hope, prevent Yosha's fate from visiting Argiv and Korlis. An old friend once told me there was power in names, and perhaps..." Urza let his voice trail off. "Perhaps that will take back Yosha for the Queen," said Tawnos. "For the Yoshan people," said Urza quickly. "For the people who trusted me and whom I delivered into my brother's hands." "Your brother has his hands full of them at the moment," said Tawnos. Urza did not reply. "I understand he leads the Falaji now." Urza nodded. "The universe changes. Yosha falls, my brother leads the Falaji, and Argiv, the crown, has lost almost all of its power. For it let Yosha worry about the desert tribes, and now Yosha is gone. The nobles hold most of the power in Pendragon, and they are very, very concerned about the Falaji crossing the ridges and attacking." "Are you?" asked Tawnos. "Worried, that is." Urza opened his arms to include the room. "This is the result of that worry, Tawnos," he said. "I can duplicate this tower in 5 days, given sufficient materials. I'm working on a way to have the Yoshan soldiers themselves build it. Imagine a line of these forts, manned by unsleeping soldiers, protecting Argiv and Korlis from the Falaji, protecting them from my brother." Tawnos nodded. "I was surprised not to see any ornithopters." Urza shook his head. They're needed to the north, patrolling the passes. Besides, sending an ornithopter aloft is sending a flare for the enemy, showing him where you are. That's another lesson learned at a great price. Urza stood there for a moment, grinding his palms. Did I tell you we have another school? In Penregon this time. Rendell is there, and his brother, Sandwell. He survived, along with a handful of others. The school is being overseen by an old friend, Ricklau. Did I ever mention Ricklau before? Urza, said Tano softly. I don't think I did, continued Urza. Anyway, there's a whole raft of young nobles, well, not young anymore, but individuals who once worked with Tokasia and who know about artifacts, who value them and are willing to help me in my research. Urza, said Tanos again. More than just power stones. I mean manpower, training, resources. Argiv is a rich country. Urza, said Tanos a third time, sharply. What is it? Asked Urza testily. Kayla is here, said Tanos. I know, the artificer said, and there was a long pause. Then he said, I know. Again, and there was a longer pause. You should go down to meet her, said Tanos. And your son. Is he really? Started Urza, hotly, but letting the question die. He has your hair, said Tanos. He has my father's hair, said Urza, and turned to look out the window again. I wish you hadn't brought them, he said after a time. By all the gods of Yosha, shouted Tanos, and Urza jumped at the sound of the younger man's voice. We have been running and hiding for 3 years now. I delivered your son, yes, your son, in the middle of a thunderstorm. I bring them all the way here, and you don't want to see them? Do you still hate her so much? Urza turned pale, and Tanos was afraid the older man was going to flinch, to flee, to pull back further within himself. No, he said at last. It's not that, not entirely. It's just that I failed. I failed to see what was coming. I failed to anticipate my brother's plan. I failed her. I failed a nation. And I failed, said Tanos grimly. And she failed. We had to live with this failure every step of the way from Krug. Is that what it is, Urza? Are you ashamed that you're just as fallible as the rest of us? A long silence between them for a moment. Then Urza sighed and said, I'm a storm crow, Tanos, a bird of ill omen. Disaster follows in my wake, and I don't want to hurt her anymore. I don't want to hurt anyone anymore. Only a fool would be at my side. Then call me a fool for one, said Tanos. I would like to go back to being your apprentice. Kayla would like to go back to being your wife. Urza turned away again, and Tanos saw raise his hands to his face, perhaps to wipe away a tear. And when Urza turned back, his face was patient and calm, and his eyes were clear. The artificer smiled. I have no need of an apprentice, and your skills with those statues prove that you are a master artificer in your own right. Well, if you don't need an apprentice, you need someone who will get behind you and give you a good thwack from time to time, said Tanos. That's a job I can do well. And do well, said Urza. I need a friend, and you've been one to me, and to the Queen. You have not failed either of us. You're wrong, said Tanos, but we can talk about that some other time. Indeed, we can, said Urza, then nodded his head. Let's go down and see my wife, and my son. Slowly, they descended the stairs from the tower. Tanos wondered if sound carried as well in the tower as it did in the old palace of Krug. Urza stopped once to point out some feature of the tower to Tanos, then shook his head and pressed on. He realized, Tanos thought, that he was delaying the inevitable. They reached the waiting room. Tanos waited at the door. Sharman set down a tray of sugar wafers and retreated to the hallway as well. Neither man left, but neither remained in the room. Kayla rose, and Urza walked over to her. They embraced, but it was a polite embrace, each resting their hands on the other's elbows. Still, they did not part, and Tanos could see tears welling in Kayla's eyes. It is good to... rasped Urza, his throat tight. He cleared his throat and said, It is good to see you again. Kayla's mouth moved, but Tanos did not hear the words. Hey, said Harbin at their feet. He pulled on Urza's smock, and the artificer looked down at the lad. Harbin looked at Urza, with all the power that a 2.5-year-old could muster, said, Uncle Tanos says you're my daddy. Are you? Urza looked at Kayla, then down at the small child. He knelt and took the lad's small hand in his own. I suppose I am, he said. I'm very pleased to meet you after all these years.